Hi, everyone, and welcome to our YouTube channel, Shrink Think. This is a series on treatment errors and treating survivors of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. I am Sandra Brown, the president at the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Research, Treatment, Education, and also the director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Chelli Pumphrey.
Hello, thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I'll just introduce myself quickly. I am a licensed professional counselor, and I'm also on the board of advisors for the association here with Sandra, and have been a trauma therapist for a good 30 years now, and specialize in working with survivors of narcissistic and pathological abuse. So excited to be here to share this information with all of you.
Well, this is our second in a series. So if you did not watch the first one, which was on trauma, I suggest you do. I shared a little bit about the history of this field, which is probably important for you to know if you are someone that's going to work in this field. And the first video talked about the treatment error related to this trauma population. And so I'm trying to sort of put these in some kind of building order. And since we were talking last time about the treatment error and trauma, we're going to follow up today with talking about what is called trauma worsening behavior. And so in that last workshop, our video, we talked a little bit about why trauma worsens in this population. And a couple of things that we had mentioned was not getting treatment or getting the wrong treatment. And we also mentioned this issue about trauma worsening, and that's what we're going to hone in on today, because this space, this genre, is so populated by traumatized survivors helping other traumatized survivors that we have a serious problem now. And you know, these traumatized survivors are not trauma-informed care. And this is, as we discussed in the last video, a big trauma population. So what have you seen in the kinds of behaviors they do that worsen their trauma that they're trying to get better from?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's not recognizing it as trauma, whether it's, you know, the survivor herself, which, you know, people that aren't therapists don't recognize, you know, don't usually recognize if they're experiencing trauma, or going to, you know, YouTube and the survivors that are blogging and offering all this stuff, that it exacerbates the trauma symptoms. It triggers more memories. It triggers more cognitive dissonance about the relationship and about themselves. And, you know, I often get people who've come in after they've, you know, paid for some coaching program or watched all these videos, and they're still a mess and have not resolved any trauma symptoms. They are very educated about what's going on. I mean, at least from what we see in the social media world, which isn't always accurate, but their trauma is worse, if not, you know, just, you know, staying the same.
Right. And we touched on this in the last video, that part of this happens because they don't know they have trauma. But sometimes even, therapists don't know they have trauma. And so, and therapists don't tend to monitor what survivors are using for recovery. They tend to think, well, if they're doing anything for themselves at all, that's a good thing, and that everybody needs psychoeducation, not understanding that this type of trauma that we alluded to last time, that the Institute calls a dual dysregulation, makes their window of tolerance very narrow. They are dually dysregulated from trauma, because that's what trauma does, but they are also dysregulated because 100% of them have cognitive dissonance. That's how we identify PLRs, in part, is through this profound symptom of cognitive dissonance, which we need to understand as destabilization and dysregulation. And so they have a double whammy. They have two avenues of dysregulation, and they, like you said, they go out onto these YouTubes by non-trauma informed care people who will share anything and, story tell, and, as a way of making a point that then sets off two forms of hyperarousal. And they, decompensate so quickly. And like I said, I mean, our practice started filling up from people coming off of these sites or out of these coaching programs. Obviously, if you have a survivor who's at the moderate PTSD or up the continuum, coaching, especially by a non-trauma informed person who story tells and suggests, here, go read my traumatic memoir. Here, sit in group, and you have not one, the survivor has not one regulation skill, and tell your your story, and it's the ethics of it is infuriating. But beyond that is these, that they're already challenged with this dual dysregulation, and to have that happen to them just really, really takes them down. Do you have other examples of what they're doing out there?
Yeah, this one is just coming to mind when you're talking about cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that I see and this happens often with people who are in therapy with a therapist who doesn't recognize the atypical trauma, but, the nature of cognitive dissonance is the survivors here coming into a therapy session every time and talking about the positive and the negative of this relationship. Like, oh, I love my partner, he's amazing, but he's horrible, he's calling me names, and it's the back and forth. And I therapists get into the comparing and contrasting with them, which is the cognitive dissonance, without even recognizing that it's just stirring the pot. It's stirring the trauma and doing nothing other than exacerbating it. And so, there's this book that's coming to mind that I've had so many survivors come to me that, somebody recommended to read this. It's actually a great book for a healthy breakup, but it's called Should I Stay or Should I Leave? And it's like giving something like that to a survivor who's in that constant should I stay or should I leave cognitive dissonance. It's like you're trying to take them down this road of trying to discern whether or not they should be in a healthy but maybe not a great or a compatible relationship.
Yeah.
Versus you are being traumatized by a pathological partner. You cannot keep doing the back and forth. We have to treat that cognitive dissonance. So that's just kind of one, general example of something that I see a lot in people that have not had appropriate treatment.
Right, and since that dual dysregulation stems, we talked about this last time, this is not, in most cases, a trauma-only population. We call it a trauma plus CD population, and that's a whole different animal, which is why this field exists. But because they have that potential with dual dysregulation from trauma and CD, going on social media, reading the traumatic memoir written by bloggers, YouTubes, meetup groups, God help us, any of those kinds of things, it is that it's just sets off that cognitive dissonance, and that's their number next to trauma, their number one symptom, is this unmanaged comparing and contrasting. And so not only, can they get triggered in their trauma, hearing other people's stories, but the worst they say for them is having the cognitive dissonance set off. Well, how can it not? Their window of tolerance is like this big. And so they go on the social media page and people are posting pictures of their wounds and texts and telling their stories, and they're off and running on, on a meltdown, not just from the trauma, but the CD. And they'll often come in and say, just make it stop. Just make it stop, kind of thing. And it inflames the one of the things that CD that we know it does to the brain is hyperneural activity. So up comes two memories, Jekyll and Hyde, and it gets played over and over and over, having twice the volume. And so one of the things we talk about in the association training is the need to know this about this population, that we got to do what I call harm reduction intervention. And that is to do no further harm. Not only do we need to do no further harm, we need to make them stop doing further harm in trauma and CD, worsening behaviors. And to do that, we have to know where they are out there. We actually give a questionnaire. I think it's like a 3-page questionnaire, and ask them to tell us everything, everywhere they are, what they're doing. And if they are stacking on trauma or reactivating their trauma quicker than we can, work on it, of course they're going to leave treatment. So as a treatment error, we need to be aware of, we can't work faster than they're piling on, worsening their trauma. And so our harm reduction sort of intervention is to know where they're at, explain to them how trauma gets worsened, ask them, to remove themselves from that and replace with trauma-informed care resources. There are social media sites run by people that won't allow that to happen. There are folks that describe without the traumatic memoir. I mean, there are other trauma-informed resources that we can give them.
Yeah, I mean, such a good point. And just I think there's so much of this that looks like, the atypical trauma, that even a good trauma therapist isn't gonna recognize it as trauma and will miss it. And this is for the survivor that's actually in therapy. So it's missing it, but there's also, you talk about the trauma worsening stuff, and there's, a lot of well-meaning therapists, and there's, all of these bloggers and survivors are well-meaning. They're trying to use their experience to help everybody, but I think we have an ethical responsibility for survivors to learn what your scope of practice is and what it isn't. And if you are not a trauma informed and PLR trained therapist, you should not be treating these people, or I can go on about that, but you have to take a look at what you're offering. And I think there's some practices with therapists, again, well-meaning, couples therapists who are working with a PLR and not allowing time alone with the two partners to even get a chance to assess what's going on with the survivor, or to even get a better look at it. Could this other one be the narcissist or a sociopath? Giving all the old treatment things of just trying to repair the marriage or keep the relationship. I mean, there's just so many things that can go wrong here that can prolong for years, prolong the suffering and the abuse.
And worsen your
Yeah.
and CD. Absolutely. And I mean, the whole reason, I try to develop a field around this is because, like I said, I learned the hard way. It took me, I'm not the fastest, quickest person on the planet. It took me a couple decades, of like, well, that doesn't work. And what is that? And why is that there? And we're trying to prevent, worsening, when there are remedies to that. And like I said, we did the Finding Competent Care study that helped us understand. It was from the survivors that talked about, treatment failure, and what worsened their trauma. Some of it they were doing to themselves, trying to help themselves, through other survivors. And another part of their trauma worsening was at our hands. Right. And so I think the point here is that this is different. It's a little bit, it is trauma work, but we've had to figure out how this population is different. And that whole really narrow window of tolerance is, a huge treatment issue for us to understand, to not, trigger that. So there's some new things to know about this population, even if you're trauma trained. That's why it's called atypical trauma. So you have anything else to add?
I think that probably covers it. I feel like I could go on a tangent about atypical trauma, but that's for another video.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the treatment error to remember: therapists err when they don't recognize, intervene, and stabilize trauma and CD worsening behaviors that lead to treatment failure. If you are interested in more training specifically on narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, our therapist training website is survivortreatment.com. And you will find our workshops leading to certification. You must start at workshop 1, which is the clinician's guide, to go on to workshop 2, which is treatment protocols. We hope we see you in training over at survivortreatment.com. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end it and log off.